Hello friends, welcome to the HFY Ode, where we bring you the new science fiction stories for you, and new adventure, new world.
They cataloged us the way a biologist pins a moth to a board. Careful, clinical, certain the specimen isn't going anywhere. They were wrong about the moth. The veil had a word for Earth. It translated roughly as the loud mudball, and they meant it affectionately, the way you might call a stray dog scrappy before you close the door on it. They'd been watching humanity for 63 of their orbital cycles, which worked out to about 41 human years, and in that time, they had compiled 17,000 pages of observational data, cross-referenced across 6 academic disciplines, and arrived at one unified conclusion. Humans were a problem that would eventually solve itself. Not cruelly. The Veil weren't cruel. They were, in fact, scrupulously kind in the way that only a species which has never genuinely feared anything can afford to be. They had unified their homeworld in the second age of their civilization, had joined the galactic meridian in the fourth, and by the seventh, the current one, they occupied 3-star systems and held 2 seats on the meridian's high council. They had not fought a war in 400 years. They had not needed to. When you are larger, smarter, longer-lived, and philosophically superior to every species you have ever encountered, war becomes an embarrassing anachronism, like a dueling pistol mounted above a fireplace, decorative evidence of a more primitive time. So they watched humanity. And humanity, as humanity does, gave them a great deal to watch. The first file Counselor Incinerat ever read on the human species was a summary report from the Meridian's Contact Division, stamped low priority, developmental species class 4, which was the bureaucratic way of saying, interesting, maybe in a few thousand years. She remembered reading it in her morning transit pod, half distracted, the way you skim a neighborhood newsletter. Humans had achieved spaceflight. Rudimentary. Combustion-based, which drew a footnote from some wit in the xenobiology department. They are literally exploding themselves into orbit. See attachment D for details. She'd laughed. She remembered that later, when everything went wrong on Kara Station. She thought about that laugh quite a lot. Kara Station was not, technically speaking, a place anyone wanted to be. It occupied a gravitational sweet spot between 2 middling stars in the Vethra cluster, which made it geometrically useful and atmospherically miserable, the kind of location that exists purely because physics permits it and commerce requires it. The station itself was a Meridian joint construction project. 3 rings, 7 docking spires, a central hub the size of a small mountain, and a population of roughly 40,000 beings drawn from 11 species, all of whom were there for reasons that were either profitable or mandatory. The Veil contingent numbered around 300. Scientists mostly. Incinerat was among them. Some are retired now. Technically an emeritus council advisor, which meant she had enough rank to command a private research berth and enough age to have stopped caring what anyone thought of her using it. She was studying Vethran stellar phenomena. She was 71, which for a Veil was somewhere in the comfortable middle of a life, the equivalent of a human in their early 40s, experienced enough to know things, young enough that the knowing still felt interesting. The human contingent at Karis numbered 6. 6 out of 40,000. They were there as part of the Meridian's Provisional Integration Program, which was the diplomatic way of saying, your species is not yet a full member, but we've decided to let you touch things under supervision. The program was Incinerat's initiative. Actually, her last major legislative act before she stepped back from council work. She'd argued, against considerable skepticism, that humanity would benefit from early exposure to Meridian infrastructure and culture. Not because humans were ready. They weren't, not really. But she'd had a feeling, impossible to quantify, deeply unscientific, that waiting for humanity to be ready was like waiting for a river to be done moving. The 6 humans assigned to Karis were given roles that were considered, within Meridian HR taxonomy, low complexity, high visibility positions. Translation: tasks that a human could handle without breaking anything critical, in locations where more experienced species could keep an eye on them. Sergeant Deo Adewale had been assigned to station security. This was, from the Vale perspective, a mostly ceremonial role. Karis hadn't experienced a genuine security incident in 11 years. The job involved patrolling corridors, monitoring atmospheric sensors, and occasionally mediating disputes between species who had incompatible ideas about noise levels or personal space. The Vale security chief, a meticulous man named Orcs, had reviewed Adewale's file with the thoroughness he applied to everything and arrived at a measured assessment, competent by human standards. While socialized, unlikely to cause incident. Orcs had noted, almost as an afterthought, that Adewale's service record included 2 combat tours in something called the Sahel Stabilization Campaign and a commendation for actions during a hostage situation in which he had apparently spent 19 hours negotiating with armed individuals while concealing a broken collarbone, because, as the report stated with remarkable blandness, the psychological impact of an injured negotiator on the parties was assessed as counterproductive. Orcs had flagged this as psychologically atypical, potentially stress-adaptive. He'd meant it as a concern. Isinarat met Adewale in the station's primary observation deck on a Thursday, the human calendar designation the Meridian had adopted for third rotation scheduling, because humans had successfully argued, in their first provisional integration meeting, that their people find temporal anchors psychologically stabilizing, and someone senior enough to matter had found this sufficiently charming to accommodate. She'd been watching the binary stars perform their slow gravitational argument when he appeared in her peripheral vision, tall, dark-skinned, wearing the gray and blue of Meridian security with the careful posture of someone who has learned that standing slightly wrong in a room full of aliens reads as aggression. He was carrying 2 thermal containers. He held one toward her. Isin counselor. His veil was careful, accented, technically correct. I make coffee at 0600. Figured, the observation deck gets cold on night rotation. Humans run warmer than most species here, but I didn't want to assume. She looked at the container. Then at him. You researched my species' thermal comfort range. I looked it up, yeah. She took the coffee. It was, she discovered, terrible, scalding, bitter, with a faintly chemical edge that she would later learn was from something called the good creamer, which was apparently a human culinary concept involving optimism over evidence. She drank all of it. They talked for an hour. He asked questions, not the performative curiosity that junior diplomats use to signal engagement, but the kind that meant he'd already been thinking about the answer and wanted to test his assumptions against someone who actually knew. He asked about Vale stellar cartography. He asked about the Meridian's conflict resolution protocols. He asked, with a careful diplomatic neutrality that she saw through immediately, whether the High Council had given any serious thought to upgrading humanity's integration status in the next cycle. You're lobbying me, she said. Absolutely not. The corner of his mouth moved. I'm a security sergeant. I'm having coffee. She liked him. She hadn't expected to. The crisis, when it arrived, didn't announce itself. That was the thing about catastrophe. The Vale had written extensively about it, had mathematical models for it, had entire philosophical frameworks built around the predictable architecture of systemic failure. And yet when it actually came, it still had this quality of wrongness, like a note played sharp in a familiar song. The first sign was a fluctuation in the station's gravitational compensators. Ring 2, Section 14, 0340 station time. The duty engineer on watch, a Thrin named Voxari, logged it as a calibration issue and queued it for morning maintenance. Standard protocol. Entirely reasonable. Voxari did not know, nobody knew yet, that what had caused the fluctuation was not a calibration issue. It was a stress fracture in the coupling between Ring 2's compensator array and the station's central structural spine, caused by 11 years of micro-vibrations from the nearby pulsing of the smaller star, building incrementally in a frequency band that the station's automated monitoring system had been checking around rather than for, because of a software update 18 months prior that had, without anyone noticing, slightly shifted the scan parameters. 11 years of a thing no one was looking at. At 0412, the fracture propagated. Ring 2 didn't separate. Not entirely. But it shifted 3 meters, which doesn't sound like much until you consider that 3 meters of structural displacement in a sealed, pressurized environment carrying 6,000 beings is the engineering equivalent of a scream. The decompression alarms went off across the entire station. Incinerat woke to the sound of them with a specific kind of cognitive speed that comes from being old enough to have heard alarms before and understanding in a half-second between sleep and consciousness that this one was not a drill. She was on her feet and at her door panel in moments, pulling up status displays. Watching Ring 2 schematics turn from green to amber to a section of red that was spreading in a way that made the part of her brain that understood structural engineering do something cold and quiet. She opened a comm channel to the station command. The channel was already screaming. She found him in the corridor outside the Ring 2 emergency bulkheads, and for a moment she didn't understand what she was looking at. 6,000 beings were trying to evacuate Ring 2 through 4 functional emergency corridors, and the result was the kind of crowd physics that stops being a crowd and starts being a fluid, pushing, compressing, nobody moving because everybody was moving. The noise is a solid thing you walked into. Adewale was at the mouth of the worst bottleneck, alone, doing something she had never seen a security officer do in 11 years of station observation. He wasn't trying to control the crowd. He was talking to it, moving through it, touching shoulders, catching arms, saying things she couldn't hear from 30 meters away, but she could see the effect rippling out from him like he was dropping stones in water. A Vale family pressed against the wall, the children panicking, and he materialized in front of them and said something, and the father's body language changed in 2 seconds from drowning to anchored. A Thren whose 4 legs had locked in the crush, fight or flight failure, something Thren do under extreme stress, and Adewale crouched to the thing's physical level and spoke to it, one hand steady on its thorax until it unlocked and moved. Orintavis appeared beside her. He was staring at Adewale. He's been there since the alarms, Orintavis said. He called it. On the comm before I'd even finished reading the structural report. He said the bottleneck is going to kill people before the fracture does. I'm going to the corridor. He was right. Yes. Orintavis's voice had a quality in it she hadn't heard from him before. He was. The red section on the schematics spread a little further. In the corridor, Adewale kept moving through the impossible noise, touching shoulders, catching people, holding the mouth of the bottleneck open through sheer force of presence. And Incinerat, who had spent 40 years studying species and writing reports and classifying humanity as class 4 low priority, give them a few thousand years, stood watching him and felt the first edge of something she would spend a long time trying to name. It was not quite shame. It was the specific, very cold feeling of being wrong about something you've been certain of for a very long time. The smaller star pulsed outside the observation windows, indifferent. The alarms kept screaming. And in the corridor, the human held the line. Not with weapons, not with technology, not with the philosophical superiority of a species 400 years past its last war. With his hands, his voice, his presence. Just that. The red on the schematics reached section 7, and somewhere deep in Ring 2, a second fracture began to propagate. This one moving toward the residential blocks, where there were still 2,000 beings who hadn't gotten out. Where Incinerat's own research quarters were. Where she had left, in her hurry, her life's work, 40 years of stellar observation data, irreplaceable, stored on a physical array she'd never gotten around to backing up to the Meridian Cloud because she'd always meant to do it tomorrow. Where she realized with a lurch that had nothing to do with the structural failure. She had also left Riva. Riva, her daughter, visiting from their home system. Asleep in the second berth of Incinerat's quarters at 0412 in Section 9 of Ring 2, which was now the wrong side of a closed emergency bulkhead. She was already moving toward the bulkhead controls when Adewale's hand closed on her arm. Counselor. His voice was very calm. The kind of calm that is not the absence of fear, but a different thing running parallel to it. You can't go back in there. My daughter is in Section 9. 1 second. That was all the pause he gave it. How old? 22. Sleeping or awake when you left? Sleeping. Does she know emergency protocols? Breach doors, shelter positions? Yes. I taught her. Her voice did something she didn't permit her voice to do in public. She stopped it. Yes. He let go of her arm. Looked at the bulkhead schematic on the wall panel. Something moved across his face that she didn't have the vocabulary for yet. Stay here, he said. Keep that corridor moving. You know how now. You watch me. Anyone freezes, touch their shoulder, say their name if you know it, give them one direction. Just one. Where are you? He was already moving toward the bulkhead. The panel required an override code to open. Security level. His clearance. He entered it. The bulkhead began to cycle. Adewale. She said his name like an argument. He turned back. Just for a moment. His face was the face of a man who has already decided and is past the point where the deciding needs to be discussed. 19 hours with a broken collarbone, he said, and she understood that he was not explaining himself. He was telling her something about what he was, about what humans were. Nobody had to know. Nobody needed to worry. It was just a thing that needed doing. The bulkhead opened. The air pressure differential hit him like a fist, and he went through it anyway. The bulkhead cycled closed behind him. Isanerat stood in the corridor for exactly 3 seconds. Then she touched the shoulder of a freezing veil civilian, said their family name, pointed toward the emergency exit, and held the bottleneck open with her voice and her hands and the thing she had just learned from watching human do it. The alarm screamed. The smaller star pulsed. Somewhere on the wrong side of a closed bulkhead, in a corridor that was structurally compromised and filling with particulate from a fracture that was still propagating, a sergeant from Earth was moving towards Section 9. Because a young woman was there. Because she was someone's daughter. Because apparently, and this was the thing that would keep Isanerat awake for years, that was enough. The inside of Ring 2 smelled like burnt metal and ozone, which meant the power conduits along the structural spine were arcing. Adewale registered this the way he registered most potentially fatal information. Calmly, in the same flat cognitive space where he kept things like the car in front is braking and that man's hands are moving wrong. Not alarm, just data. The kind that adjusts your next 3 decisions without needing to stop and have a conversation about it. He moved through the corridor at a jog, staying left where the ceiling stress fractures were visible. Right side had a seam separation that looked load-bearing and unhappy, and pulled up the station map on his wrist display. Section 9 was 200 meters in, then a left through a pressure door, then a residential block that the structural report had flagged as amber before it flagged as red, which meant it was probably still standing and probably meant nothing at all given that the report had also missed the fracture for 11 years. Behind him, the bulkhead was sealed. Ahead of him, the corridor groaned. Stations groaned sometimes, even healthy ones. Metal contracting in the thermal differential, the ordinary physics of a structure holding itself together. He knew what that sounded like. This wasn't it. This was the sound of something holding on past the point of confidence, doing it on stubbornness and residual structural integrity, the engineering equivalent of a man carrying too much weight down a long road who hasn't quite decided to stop yet. He'd heard that sound before. In people. He moved faster. The pressure door to the residential block was locked. Of course it was. Emergency protocol sealed non-emergency route doors automatically, and the automation didn't know about daughters asleep in Section 9, and automation generally did not care about the things that made any individual situation specific and human and real in the way that bureaucratic systems were specifically designed to not have to think about. He pulled the manual override panel from the wall behind a small cover, read, "Emergency use only in 6 languages," and discovered that the override required a physical key that he did not have because physical keys for non-security doors were held by the maintenance division, and the maintenance division's duty officer was currently on the evacuation side of the bulkhead. He stood there for approximately 1.5 seconds. Then he took off his boot. The heel of a Meridian Standard security boot was composite ceramic with a titanium reinforcement strip along the impact edge. designed to be worn for 20-hour shifts on metal grating without joint degradation. It was not, technically speaking, designed to be used as an impact tool on a door mechanism panel. But the gap between designed for and capable of was, in Adewale's experience, one of the more useful gaps in the universe, and he had a 19-year career's worth of practice at living in it. 3 strikes. The panel housing cracked. A 4th angled, and the mechanism inside became accessible in a way it had not previously been, and he worked a manual release with 2 fingers and a lot of focused patience, and the door opened. He put his boot back on. The residential block was dark except for emergency lighting. Red, which turned everything the color of a developing photograph, and turned the 3 beings huddled at the far end of the corridor into shapes he had to process for a moment before identifying. 2 Thren, smaller, juveniles, and between them, one arm around each, a young veil woman in sleeping clothes with her back against the wall, and her expression set in the kind of concentrated, effortful calm that looked to someone who recognized it exactly like controlled fear. Not panic, controlled fear. He filed that away. It would matter later. Riva, he called it down the corridor because he didn't know the veil custom for announcing yourself in an emergency, and he learned a long time ago that the human instinct to say a name, to individualize, to say I see you specifically, tended to land correctly across most species lines. She looked up. Her eyes were the same pale amber gray as her mother's. Your security? Her standard was accented differently than Isenarat's. Younger. The consonants softer. Sergeant Adewale, your mother sent me. This was not entirely accurate. Her mother had told him to stay, and he had disagreed with this instruction non-verbally by walking through a bulkhead, but it was functionally true in all the ways that mattered. Are you injured? No, they are. She indicated the Thren juveniles. The smaller one has a compound fracture in its second left leg. I've immobilized it with. She held up a length of material he recognized as a sleeping robe, torn into strips. I don't know Thren physiology well enough to know if I've done it right. The larger one is in fight lock. Has been for 20 minutes. He crouched down to the Thren level. The smaller one's leg was in fact immobilized correctly. Not perfectly, but correctly, the fracture aligned and supported in a way that would prevent further displacement. He looked at Riva. Where did you learn to do that? My mother spends a lot of time in mixed species environments. I grew up reading her research files. A pause. Also, there's no way to watch Kara Station emergency training holos and not end up knowing something about Thren anatomy. Your mother, he said, is going to give me so much trouble about this. Something shifted in the young woman's face. She's safe. In the corridor. Running crowd management. Running crowd. She absorbed this. Yes, that sounds correct. That sounded extremely like her. The corridor groaned again. Louder this time. The emergency lighting flickered, steadied, flickered. He stood up. Quick calculation. The smaller Thren couldn't walk on the fractured leg, which meant he was carrying it. The larger one was in fight lock, which was a Thren neurological response to extreme threat. Their version of a freeze response, except it presented as rigid posture and locked joints rather than stillness. And the standard unlock protocol was sustained low-frequency sound vibration applied to the thoracic plates. He did not have a low-frequency sound vibration device. He had a voice, 2 hands, and a composite ceramic boot heel. Can you carry its weight if I unlock it? Riva looked at the larger Thren, who was perhaps 1.5 times her mass. Yes. No Hosetashchen. He noted this. He pressed both palms flat against the locked Thren's thorax and hummed, low, sustained, a note from the back of his chest that he'd learned from a xenobiology briefing given by a Thren researcher in Nairobi 18 months ago, a briefing he'd attended voluntarily on his day off because he'd been going to Kara Station and he'd wanted to understand the beings he might need to help. The Thren shuddered. Locked joints released. It listed sideways, and Riva caught it before it fell, one arm around its thorax, taking the weight with the kind of muscle memory that suggested she was either stronger than she looked or had decided not to care about the physics. He picked up the smaller Thren. It made a sound, not paying quite. More like a question. You're okay, he told it. We're moving. Stay still. He didn't know if Thren understood that. It stayed still. The corridor back to the pressure door was worse than when he'd come through. Not structurally, yet, but the air was different. Thicker. The arcing conduits were putting particulate into the atmosphere, and the emergency ventilation was either overwhelmed or offline, and the combination of red lighting and suspended particles gave the whole corridor the quality of moving through something that was trying to become solid. His eyes stung. Behind him, he could hear Riva breathing, controlled, measured, the deliberate rhythm of someone managing their body's urge to panic through conscious regulation. Not panic. Never panic. He thought about that. About what it meant that a 22-year-old, woken by decompression alarms in an emergency she had no training for, had found 2 injured juveniles in a lockdown block and responded by immobilizing fractures and managing fight lock instead of screaming at the walls. Isanerat's daughter. Of course. Did you know my mother? Riva asked. She was keeping herself talking. He understood. The same technique. Keep the brain busy with language so the instinctive brain doesn't hijack the motor functions. Somewhat. We had coffee on observation deck Thursdays. She mentioned a human security officer she found interesting. A beat. She said you ask good questions. High praise. From her, genuinely yes. The pressure door was ahead. He shifted the Thren juvenile's weight, reached the door, and then the second fracture propagated. He felt it before he heard it. A vibration that moved up from the deck plates through his boots and into his spine, the specific frequency of a structure deciding something, and then the sound arrived, a crack that was too big to be one thing breaking and turned out to be the entire ceiling section of the corridor between them and the pressure door coming down in a controlled but very enthusiastic diagonal that blocked approximately 60% of the passable width and introduced a great deal of debris into the remaining 40. Riva said something in Veil that his translation in Plant rendered as, "Oh, that is extremely bad." He agreed. The gap was 50 centimeters wide at its narrowest, and narrowing, the debris pile still settling, the ceiling section still creaking through its final geometry. He had approximately 90 seconds before the settling completed in a way that would close the gap entirely, or possibly bring down what was left of the ceiling above it. He put the Thren juvenile down. Gently. Through the gap, he told Riva. Now, take the small one. It's 50 centimeters. You'll fit. I've seen you hold a Thren twice your weight. That's not the same calculation, Riva. He used the same note he'd used with the Thren in Fight Lock. Not commanding. Anchoring. Through. Now. She looked at him for 1 full second. Then, she picked up the juvenile, tucked it against her body in a way that minimized its profile, turned sideways, and moved through the gap with 4 inches to spare, emerging on the other side in a controlled stumble that she caught before it became a fall. She turned back. He was looking at the gap, at his own considerably larger profile, at the debris above it, which was not, at this moment, what anyone would call stable. 60 centimeters. He was not 60 centimeters wide. Not anywhere close. Adewale. Her voice had changed. The controlled calm was still there, but underneath it something had cracked open. He looked at the locked Thren, looked at the gap, ran the calculation once, which was enough. Keep moving, he said. Straight corridor, then the bulkhead on your left. I gave your mother my override code. It's, you are not. You cannot stay there. The code is 77 Kepler 49. He kept his voice even. Certain. The voice of someone who has already made the decision and is now in the cleaner space on the other side of it. Isanerat can input it from the panel. You need to keep moving because that ceiling section is going to complete its travel in about 40 seconds, and if you're still here when it does, we've both wasted our time. I won't. Your mother, he said, is on the other side of that bulkhead. Go. The ceiling groaned. Something in Riva's face broke and reformed in about 1.5 seconds, and he recognized it because he'd seen it in his own face once, in a mirror in a military hospital, after a decision was made, and you're on the far side of it, and the only thing left was to carry it. She turned. She ran. He heard her footsteps receding down the corridor, the Thrin juvenile making that questioning sound again, and then the ceiling section completed its travel with a final grinding concussion that sent him back 2 steps and filled the gap completely and left him on the wrong side of it alone in 40% air quality and red emergency light with a fight-locked Thrin and nothing ahead of him but a corridor that went the wrong direction. He looked at the Thrin. Well, he said. He picked it up again. Let's find another way. Here is what the Meridian Incident Report would later record, because incident reports record the things that are measurable. At 0441 station time, the secondary fracture in Ring 2, Section 8 completed propagation, blocking the primary access route between Section 9 and the emergency bulkhead. At 0443, Provisional Integration Security Personnel Sergeant D. Adewale was confirmed on the Section 9 side of the blockage with 1 Thrin juvenile casualty. Atmospheric quality in the blocked section registered at 41% standard. Structural integrity of ceiling and wall sections rated critical. Estimated time before further propagation, 11 to 14 minutes. At 0444, Sergeant Adewale activated the station's maintenance access network from a secondary utility panel, which required knowledge of the station's non-public infrastructure schematics, which he had apparently been studying in his off hour for the 3 months since his assignment to Karis, which his section chief had not known about because no one had thought to ask why a security sergeant was spending his Tuesday evenings reading maintenance engineering documents. Nobody had thought to ask because he was, after all, just a human. Class 4. Low priority. Give them a few thousand years. The maintenance shaft that Adewale identified, cross-referenced against the real-time structural integrity readings he was pulling from the station's sensor network via a maintenance interface that security personnel weren't strictly supposed to have access to, but which he had apparently been quietly learning to use, ran parallel to the block corridor at a depth of 2 meters below the deck plating. It was not designed for a being of his size, or any being larger than a maintenance drone. He looked at the shaft access panel, looked at the Thrin juvenile, which had approximately 15 kilograms of mass and a fractured leg and no capacity to make its own decisions at the moment, looked at the ceiling, ran the calculation one more time. Then he opened the shaft, lowered the Thrin in first, and followed it. The Meridian Incident Report would note that the maintenance shaft in question had a usable internal diameter of 42 centimeters. It would not speculate on how he managed it. Incident reports don't speculate. But somewhere in the footnotes, a Vail structural engineer who reviewed the case afterward wrote a single annotation, unprompted and apparently somewhat awestruck. The subject appears to have made himself smaller than he was. I do not know how to quantify this. I'm not sure it can be quantified. On the safe side of the bulkhead, Isanerat heard footsteps and turned. Riva came through the gap at a run, Thrin juvenile in arms, eyes bright, and would in the red emergency light, and Isanerat crossed the corridor in 4 strides, and they collided. One of those collisions that isn't an accident, that is the opposite of an accident, and for a moment neither of them said anything. Then Isanerat pulled back and looked at her daughter's face and read it. 41 years of reading faces, non-human and human, across a dozen species, and 2 council terms, and a career built on the premise that communication was mostly the things that didn't get said. She read her daughter's face. She looked at the bulkhead. The code, she said very quietly. He gave you the code to give me. Riva said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. Isanerat turned to the panel. Entered 77 Kepler 49 with hands that were, she noticed distantly, not quite steady. The bulkhead began a cycle. It opened to the blocked section, red air, heavy with particulate, the structural groaning of Ring 2 in its last functional minutes. And it was empty, which told her nothing good. Section 9 was 300 meters in. Adewale and the second Thrin juvenile were somewhere between here and there, and the structural integrity of everything between here. And there was the maintenance shaft access panel on the floor for meters inside the bulkhead, open from below. A hand appeared first, pushed up. Then, with a scraping sound that she would describe later as the specific noise of a person convincing a space to be larger than it is, Deo Adewale emerged from a 42-centimeter shaft with a Thrin juvenile in his arms and red lighting turning the particulate in his hair to something that looked, in that moment, genuinely unworldly. He stood up, looked at her. His expression was the face of a man who has done a difficult thing and has not yet decided whether to be proud of it. I found another way, he said. Isanerat, who had spent 41 years developing the linguistic precision to say exactly what she meant in 6 languages across 2 galactic institutions, opened her mouth. Nothing came out. He walked past her into the safe corridor, set the Thrin juvenile down in the arms of a waiting medical officer, and sat down against the wall with the careful movement of a man whose body has been informed of several decisions it hadn't been consulted on and is now presenting the bill. Riva crouched beside him. They spoke quietly, too quietly for Isanerat to hear from where she stood, still at the bulkhead, which she realized she had not moved away from. She was still holding the door. She made herself let go of it. She walked toward them. Behind her, Ring 2 finished its decision, and the intersections came down in the long, grinding descent of a thing that had held on past the point of reason and could finally, now stop. No one was in it. Everyone was out. She stood over the humans sitting against her wall, and her daughter beside him, and the question that had been building since 0412, since he walked through a bulkhead for a girl he'd never met, since he carried a Thrin through a 42-centimeter shaft, since he said, let's find another way to an empty red corridor, as if it were simply the next obvious step. That question finally arrived at the surface in the form it had always been. Who are you people? She didn't ask it. Not yet. But she looked at him, this human, class 4, low priority, and she thought about 17,000 pages of observational data and 11 orbital cycles of surveillance, and 1 laugh in a transit pod reading about combustion rockets, and she understood, in the way you understand something that rearranges the furniture of an entire belief system, that they had been measuring the wrong things. All of them. For a very long time. The Meridian High Council convened its emergency session on Karis 12 days after Ring 2 finished its collapse. Not because 12 days was the standard timeline for emergency sessions. It was not. The standard timeline was 48 hours. But Counselor Isanerat had requested the delay specifically, and Isanerat was a woman whose request carried the full weight of 41 years of being right about things, and so the council waited. She spent those 12 days doing something she had not done in years. She read, not reports, not classifications, not the tidy, bounded summaries that the contact division produced, and filed in order of priority, class 1 through class 4, most interesting at the top. She read history. Human history, the actual kind, the kind written by humans for humans, not the translated summaries produced by Meridian xenologists who were very thorough and completely wrong about the subtext. She read about a man named Shackleton who got his entire crew trapped in Antarctic ice, and then sailed an open boat through the world's most dangerous ocean rather than leave a single one of them. She read about a woman named Nightingale who walked into a military hospital that was killing more men than the war, and stood in the gap with nothing but a lamp and a ledger, and did not move. She read about a species that had, time and again across thousands of years and 10,000 disasters, produced these people who stood in the corridors of impossible situations and held the bottleneck open until everyone else got through. Not because they were ordered to, not because their biology required it, not because the philosophical frameworks of their civilization had reached a sufficient stage of development to mandate self-sacrifice as a rational ethical choice. Because someone needed them to. Because it was, in the most pragmatic and barefaced possible terms, the thing that needed doing. She read for 12 days. She took no meetings. She held no briefings. She sat in her temporary quarters on the surviving ring of Karis Station. They were rebuilding. The Thrin construction teams were already there. The sound of repair was a constant low hum through the walls. And she read, and she thought, and on the 12th day, she walked into the emergency council session and delivered a 40-minute address that she had been composing in one form or another for her entire career. Adewale didn't know any of this was happening. He knew that there had been a council session request because Orintavis had told him, in the careful tone of a man choosing his words with precision, that his name had come up in connection with it. He knew that the Meridian's legal division had flagged 3 separate protocol violations from his actions on the night of the fracture: unauthorized bulkhead entry, maintenance network access by non-technical personnel, and, somewhat imaginatively, inappropriate use of emergency infrastructure, which was the official designation for what he'd done to the pressure door mechanism with his boot heel. He was told, not in trouble. They just wanted to understand. He spent the 12 days writing his incident report, which took longer than he expected because the form assumed a logic of action that didn't quite map to what had actually happened. And he kept arriving at fields that asked things like justification for protocol deviation, and finding that the honest answer, a young woman was in there, did not fit in the provided text box. He wrote it anyway. In the margins, where the form allowed free text, a young woman was in there. Her mother was on the other side. 42 centimeters is enough if you decide it is. The protocol assumes a static situation. Situations are not static. This is the thing I would like the form to understand. He sent the report. He went back to his shift. He patrolled the surviving corridors of Kara Station at 0600, past the observation deck where the binary stars were doing their eternal gravitational argument. And he made coffee badly in his quarters. The replicator on the surviving ring had a different calibration, and he hadn't figured out the creamer adjustment yet. And he thought about home with the specific quality of thought that is not longing, but is something adjacent to it. The way you carry a place inside you, and sometimes set it down on a surface to look at it. On the 9th day, Riva found him on the observation deck. She sat beside him without asking. He didn't mind. She had her mother's silences, not empty, but full, occupied by something that was doing work. They watched the stars for a while. "My mother is writing something," she said finally. "The council address? You know about it. Orintavis told me my name came up." She was quiet again. Then, she's been reading human history. She hasn't slept more than 4 hours in 9 days, and she's had approximately 100 cups of your terrible coffee, and she won't tell me what she's writing, which means it's either brilliant or it's going to end her career. She paused. Possibly both. What do you think she's going to say? Riva turned to look at him. Her face in the starlight had the quality of her mother's. That precision, the sense of someone who chose every word with full knowledge of the weight it carried. But there was something in it that was specifically hers. Something that had not been there before Ring 2. "I think," she said carefully, "that she spent 41 years studying a species and observing a species and classifying a species, and she thought she understood what she was studying. And then she watched you hold a corridor open for 400 beings you'd never met. And she understood that she had been studying the outside of the thing. A beat. She's going to say that the outside of the thing is not the thing." He thought about that. "She's going to be right," he said. "She generally is." Riva looked back at the stars. It's extremely annoying. The smaller star pulsed, the way it always did. Indifferent. Ancient, going about its 10 billion year business with complete disregard for the dramas occurring in its general vicinity. Adewale thought about that, about the scale of it. 42 centimeters was nothing against 10 billion years. The difference between alive and not was nothing against that. And yet, can I ask you something? Riva said. Go ahead. The shaft. 42 centimeters. She said it simply, not making it dramatic, just a fact set on the table between them. You knew before you went in. You knew the geometry. Yes. And you went in anyway. Yes. She was quiet, working something out. He let her work. Why? She said finally. Not. I know why you went in. I mean the calculation. You had to know there was a real possibility you wouldn't fit, or couldn't get out, or the shaft would. She stopped. You had to run that calculation. So the why I'm asking is, how do you make that calculation and still go? He sat with the question. It deserves sitting with. You ever carried something heavy, he said, for a long time, and then put it down? Yes. The decision is the thing. Once you make it, You put down the weight of whether you're going to make it. You already know. The rest is just physics, logistics, things you can work on. He looked at the stars. The calculation you're talking about, it happens before the decision. Once you decide, the calculation changes. The question isn't can I fit anymore. The question is what angle. Reva stared at him for a long moment. That is, she said slowly, either the most insane thing I've ever heard, or it explains an enormous amount about your species. Possibly both. She laughed. It was a good laugh. Her mother's laugh, with something wilder underneath it. The council address lasted 41 minutes. Isanerat delivered it without notes, which was unusual. She stood at the speaker's position, a slightly raised arc before the semicircular council chamber, the 12 seated members arranged in their traditional order of seniority. And she spoke. She began with data, numbers, classifications, the accumulated 58 years of meridian contact observation on humanity. She walked through it efficiently, the way she always presented. No waste, no ornamentation, the facts in the order that made them most clearly understood. Then she stopped. She said, I would like to tell you about a maintenance shaft. The council chamber had the specific silence of 12 high-ranking beings who were not sure where this was going. She told them about the shaft. About 42 centimeters. About a decision made in a blocked corridor with 11 minutes of structural integrity remaining and a Thrin juvenile that couldn't walk. She told it plainly, without theater, because it didn't need theater. The facts, laid out in sequence, did the work that all the metaphors in the world couldn't. Then she said, our 17,000 pages of observational data on humanity measures their technology, their biology, their geopolitical organization, their resource consumption, their projected developmental timeline toward meridian-compatible civilization standards. She paused. It does not measure what happened in that corridor. It does not have a category for it. And I would like to propose to this council that the category we are missing is the most important thing about them. Councillor Arevnom, who represented the Thrin home system and was one of the council's more experienced skeptics, said, you're describing an individual action by an individual being. This is not a species characteristic. With respect, Isanerat said, I am describing a characteristic so consistent across human history that they have built entire mythological systems, religious traditions, philosophical schools, and narrative arts around it. The individual who stands in the gap. The one who stays when everyone else is gone. They don't celebrate it because it's rare. They celebrate it because they recognize it, because it is legible to them in a way that tells you everything about what they value. She let that sit. We've been classifying them by what they've built. I'm suggesting we look at what they run toward. The chamber was quiet. They're not the most powerful species we've encountered, she continued. Not the most long-lived, not the most philosophically developed, not the most technologically advanced. But they are, and I have searched our entire xenological archive for a comparable example and found none. The most specifically, stubbornly, constitutionally oriented toward doing the thing that needs doing when everyone and everything is telling them not to. She looked at the 12 faces arrayed before her. We misclassified them, not because we made an error in data collection, because we were measuring the wrong dimension. Arevnom was quiet for a moment. Then, he said, carefully, the Thran juveniles. My constituents' children. They were in Section 9. Yes. He carried them out. One under each arm, through a space designed for a maintenance drone. Yes. Another silence. Longer. What are you proposing? Asked Councillor Dayweth from the Vale's second seat. Immediate reclassification of humanity's integration status. Full membership application review. Expedited. And she paused. This was the part she hadn't been sure about until 3 nights ago, sitting over her 100th cup of terrible coffee, staring at the stars. And I am proposing that we revisit the philosophical framework by which we evaluate species for readiness. Because I think we have been asking the wrong question. We ask, have they developed enough? I think the question we should be asking is, when everything is lost, what do they do? She let the chamber hold that. Because there's a type of strength, she said, that does not appear in developmental timelines. that doesn't manifest in weapons or infrastructure or philosophical frameworks. It manifests in corridors, in maintenance shafts, in the decision to go back in. She looked at the council she had served for 20 years. We have spent 400 years not needing that type of strength. I think we have forgotten what it looks like. I think we've been quietly, philosophically, fortunate enough to have never needed to remember. Counselor Arevnom, who had not moved in several minutes, said, "You're saying they would die for strangers." "I'm saying they would make themselves smaller than they are," she said. "For strangers. For people not of their soil, not of their species, not of their history. Yes, consistently, across thousands of years and every disaster their civilization has ever encountered." She let the weight of it settle. "I'm saying that this is not primitive. I am saying this is possibly the most advanced thing I have ever observed in 41 years of studying sentient life." The vote passed 11-1. Arevnom was the one. He changed his vote the following morning, after a conversation that he declined to make public, but which was reportedly something to do with the medical status report on two Thrin juveniles, currently recovering in the station infirmary, who had told their parents, in Thrin, that the human who carried them had not stopped talking to them the whole way through the dark, just to let them know someone was there, just to let them know they weren't alone. The vote passed 12-0. Isanerat found Adewale on the observation deck one last time before she left Karis 3 days later. The repairs were progressing. The station hummed with the sound of people rebuilding, which was its own kind of music, purposeful, incremental, the sound of things being put back in order. She brought coffee. His coffee. The terrible kind. She'd asked Riva to teach her. He looked at the container. Then at her. A slow recognition moved across his face. "You've been reading," he said. "Quite a lot, yes." She sat beside him. They watched the binary stars conduct their ancient, patient argument. "The council voted," she said. "Your species' application for full Meridian membership has been accepted for expedited review. Provisional integration status has been upgraded to associate standing, effective immediately." She paused. "I expect full membership within 2 cycles." He was quiet. "You did that," he said. "I had help." She looked at the stars. From a maintenance shaft. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was its neighbor. "You should know," she said, "that Arevnom, the Thrin counselor, wants to host a formal recognition ceremony. His people have a tradition for beings who protect children at personal cost." She glanced at him. "It involves a lot of ritual touching of the thorax, which I understand may be somewhat. I'll manage. I thought you might." They sat in the silence that had become familiar between them over Thursday mornings, and bad coffee, and the kind of time that teaches you things about a person you can't learn from a file. The smaller star pulsed. The larger one answered, the way it always did, in the slow grammar of gravity. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Go ahead." "The Sahel. 19 hours. The broken collarbone." She said it carefully, as if the words were tools she needed to hold correctly. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" He thought about that. She could see him thinking about it. Not performing the consideration, actually doing it the way he did most things, fully without waste. "Because they had enough to worry about," he said finally. "Because the moment they knew I was hurt, they'd have started worrying about me instead of listening to what I was telling them. And what I was telling them was important. What was happening to me was..." He stopped. Reconsidered. A collarbone was a collarbone. What was happening in that room was something else. The room was more important than you were. The people in the room. She sat with that. "We have a word," she said slowly. "An old veil. Pre-unification. Beres. It means, approximately, the one who considers themselves last. Not selfless exactly. Not self-destructive. Just ordered differently. Last is not lesser. Last is the shape of everything else getting out first." She looked at him. "We haven't had much use for it in 400 years. I had forgotten it existed until I started reading human history and found that you have 37 words for it, in 37 different languages, all pointing at the same thing." Adewale was quiet for a moment. "What's the human word for it?" he asked. She thought about all 37. about Shackleton and Nightingale and the specific genetic stubbornness of a species that looked at an impossible gap and asked what angle. About a sergeant who had studied maintenance schematics on his Tuesdays so that someday, if he needed to, he'd know another way. Depends on who you ask, she said. Some of them say duty. Some say love. Some say they don't have a word for it at all. They say it's just, she paused, looked at him, the thing that needed doing. He looked at the stars. Yeah, he said, that about covers it. The smaller star pulsed one more time, as it had for 10 billion years and would for 10 billion more, indifferent to the drama of small beings in small corridors making themselves smaller than they were. But the thing that had happened in that corridor would travel now, through the Meridian's 17,000 pages of reclassified data, through the Revnom's formal recognition ceremony with all its thorax touching, through Riva's memory, which would eventually become a chapter in a paper she would write in her third year of xenological study, a paper cited enough times to eventually become foundational reading in Meridian contact ethics, through Isanerat's address, reprinted and distributed to 6 species academic institutions under the title, On the Mismeasurement of Humanity, a Corrective, through the vote, 12-0, through all of it, the thing that a human had done in a dark corridor for a girl not of human soil, for a Thrin juvenile that could not speak his language, for the sheer stubbornness of the belief that last was a position you chose and not one that was chosen for you. That was the thing. That was what they'd missed. Not the rockets, not the weapons, not the cities or the philosophies or the centuries of chaotic, noisy, frequently catastrophic history. The 42 centimeters, the decision to go in anyway, the understanding, older than any civilization, older than any star, that some things were worth being last for. Isanerat drank her terrible coffee to the end. It was still bad. She'd learned to love it.